Hey there, bud. I have a few things to note before the video starts. Firstly, spoilers, of course. When have I not spoiled movies? Secondly, I did not realize what a horse girl is. This will make sense later in the video. I just wanted to say that I call this character Horse Girl because she reminds me of Alison Brie. I don't know if you've seen it. The movie Horse Girl from 2020. Is she actually one? Not technically, I think. The point is that I'm not a misogynist. I just hate women. Thirdly and lastly, assuming that this is not the first video of mine that you have seen, remember when I said that I'm going to try to put out shorter videos? Yeah, me too. Enjoy the programming. Good news! I was able to get the facehugger off of my face shortly after blacking out after taking the thumbnail photo for my last video, but I am fine. But just in case that I do not make it, I just wanted to say that I hope that Alien Romulus is at least a 6 out of 10. I take back what I said about the romance. Anyway, I would like to discuss a movie that I saw a year ago and then again recently. This is one for which I have been putting off writing a review because I feel like what feels off about this movie, mostly in comparison to the one before it, is just difficult to grasp, or it was for me at least. I had to rewatch it in order to pick out the elements that seemed out of place, which ultimately made the movie a lukewarm, mild watch, rather than the invigorating, unnerving, albeit imperfect, feat that was its predecessor. Also, I apologize in advance. I should probably take that out so that I can clean up the frame a bit, but I have a Razer laptop at the moment. If you know, you know. I will just use that space to bring up whatever I end up referencing throughout the video, because that's something that I noticed with my last few videos. I don't have enough space off to the side so that I can just take the focus off of my face and, zoom in and not, clip the side of my face like it is now. The movie about which I am speaking is, of course, Evil Dead Rise. Let us discuss what makes it imperfect in my eyes, and then let's also see if I can find a way to compare it to Alien by the end of this video. What? Obsessed? No. Evil Dead Rise is a horror sequel, remake, reboot, soft reboot to Evil Dead from 1981 and Evil Dead 2 from 1987. There are, of course, other entries like Army of Darkness and even other mediums like with Evil Dead comics, through which one can get their Evil Dead fix, but for the sake of comparison, I'm going to fixate on these two latest additions to the ED saga, because I really only feel like going through these two, and I have not yet seen the Evil Dead TV show. I tried twice, but couldn't get into it. I guess the question is my rejection of the Evil Dead renditions that fall into the comedic horror subgenre informing my opinions today? Probably. Evil Dead Rise is directed by Lee Cronin, who was, before this movie, chiefly known for his atmospheric horror film, The Hole in the Ground. I do not have too much to say about that. It was decent, but ultimately forgettable, seeing that I never thought about it after seeing it, and it was a bit predictable in my opinion. In classic Neo Evil Dead fashion, the movie was also written by Cronin, the director, so we are seeing and are likely to see that in future sequels they institute a sort of directorial creative dictatorship. Okay, that's a bit dramatic, but the point is that this movie is mostly at this one man's mercy. This is Lee Cronin's vision. I mean, of course, the film's production is overseen by the creators of Evil Dead at large, I believe that's just Sam Raimi and actor Bruce Campbell from the original, but I will just be referring to Lee Cronin as the sole creator for ease of repetition. I also know that there are many more ingredients to this pie, but the politics of the production are honestly lost on me. Today I would really just like to focus on the outcome primarily. So, the movie. Let's just say that there is a reason why Fede Alvarez, the director and one of two writers of Evil Dead 2013, took the movie in the direction he did. You see, he opted to reinvent the original while heavily borrowing from the plot of the first two. And then, in order to do that, it was of great importance that they really only borrow from the narrative and set pieces, because most of the rest of Evil Dead Originals' essence lent themselves to their respective horror subgenre, influenced by their respective zeitgeist. Yep. In order to reinvent Evil Dead, they had to change, among other things, the evil with which the characters were faced and the logic and physics dictating what was or is possible in that universe. What makes sense. The movie resultantly became much more realistic and thus dark, because while you might not look at Evil Dead or Evil Dead 2 at that now and take them too seriously, at least I wouldn't, I guess, generational thing. Whatever, the plots of those movies are doubtlessly grotesque and quite depressing if you think about it. The employment of animated, surreal, and even comical effects, as well as comic relief in Evil Dead Rise, no doubt in reference to that aforementioned essence of its predecessors, most notably Evil Dead 2, I think. That is not, in my humblest of opinions, befitting to what is a movie that takes itself rather serious for the most part. It is almost like Cronin wanted to embrace the B-movie horror of the first and the gritty, unrelenting terror of the second, but he did not seem to consider how these opposing tones might offset one another. I think that the reason why Cronin did this was in an attempt to service the fans, as were many of the details of the movie down to the characters' names, murder weapons, and deaths. Let's just say that there is a reason why the Easter eggs and callbacks in Evil Dead 2013 were mostly limited to physical objects and names, and not effects, or at least not ones at odds with the newfound tone of the film. In my opinion, what made Evil Dead 2013 so special and quite frankly superior to its sequel is that it put its characters through truly unpleasant, repulsive experiences, and it did so without cluing us into who might live or die, how they might suffer, or what they might do next within the confines of their principal setting. In other words, what I liked about Evil Dead 2013 was that it was unrelentingly horrific, which lent itself to making the protagonist's, Mia is her name, her journey to sobriety, it made it so much more daunting. First talk about the plot and my grievances, or at least a few of them, with it, because I have a few. Unfortunately, we needn't look any further than about the first half hour to discover nonsensical nonsense. Plot conveniences that detract from the movie upon further scrutiny, as always. Now, I know that Evil Dead 2013 had its fair share of plot conveniences, but I think I'll get to that, and also why they do not stand out quite as much as they do here soon. Alright, the demon. The discovery and release of evil in this movie is catalyzed by a series of events, perfect events really, and character decisions that fly in the face of reason. This movie is sort of like an eclipse for our characters that demands that a few too many moons align in order for it to work out in the way that our writers or writer wanted it to. In Evil Dead 2013, which I will now refer to as just Evil Dead from now on, the discovery of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, the Book of the Dead, starts almost immediately upon entering the cabin and discovering a scene where an exorcism of sorts was performed, and in a proper opening scene. They discover this because of the stench of rotting cats, not to mention the fact that the cabin had clearly been broken into. The discovery there is mostly natural, smooth, and pretty immediate. The book in the basement stood out, and thus this is where the plot conveniences begin to come into play. The history teacher of the group gets curious, but that makes sense if there's going to be a history teacher present. See, this, at least in my opinion, is easy to overlook and somewhat excusable. This is really the case for most of the movie's plot conveniences. I am sure that history teachers everywhere have a good grasp on folklore, but I will admit that it is convenient that he was the right kind of history buff. Anyway, the group is plagued by boredom, which is apparent, so it makes sense for the guy to eventually stumble upon the phrase Kunda Estrada Montose Kunda. I probably butchered the Latin pronunciation, so I doubt that anything's going to happen. In Evil Dead Rise, however, after all of our protagonists' relatives inexplicably sit at the dining room table not eating, the kids are shooed away to get pizza while their mom and aunt have a little talk.
Danny, go take my car and get pizza with your sisters.
Upon returning, there is an earthquake, which makes the staircase above, at most the 5th floor, collapse, and then the floor to the car garage cracks in such a way that anyone can conveniently crawl down, which the eldest of the kids does do. Look, it rained and flooded in Evil Dead, deterring everyone from escaping for fear of losing their car to the flash flood. We can thus presume that this was supernatural, as was the staircase conveniently collapsing, but the way in which this book is discovered, however, is very unnatural and a bit cheap. So not only does the floor break away just above a secret bank vault too, but like I said, one of the kids goes down into that probably structurally unsound basement to very briefly look through cabinets and papers before immediately happening upon the very book in vinyl records that the kid needs in order to summon the Evil Dead. I wonder, can we excuse the kid's behavior by assuming that he was influenced to go check it all out? Well, no. So the movie gave no indication of there being any supernatural element guiding him, just like I excused the history teacher being what he was, a history teacher. I can excuse the kid being an audiophile. However, I cannot excuse the very poorly constructed first act's lazy plot driving. While Cronin managed to cram a bunch of solely visual Easter eggs and establishing shots, foreshadowing future events, of course, and I guess also future deaths, or we'll get to that, I do have to fault him for not finding a better way to drive the plot forward, especially when the movie was only an hour and a half. They could have added a bit more to that runtime. Maybe I should have a look at the screenplay, if that is available. I might be able to catch a glimpse at what the hell he was thinking when writing the first half hour of the movie. To better illustrate my point regarding how some elements of the movie are at odds with others, tonally, let's analyze the opening scene and then talk about its general characteristics. Alright, so the scene is not a precursor or that first death sneak peek employed by numerous horror films, including Evil Dead, but it was a preview of what is to come. That is to say that we are seeing what will supersede whichever events are to come later in the movie, which were honestly a weak attempt at subverting expectations, if that is what it was meant to be. It was also a bit of a letdown, if I'm being honest, and not just because I feel cheated out of an extra death scene. The opening scene of this movie was a letdown. I am of the opinion that they should have just left this for the end of the movie, since the ending for our main cast is also a bit prosaic and dissatisfying. You should see this exemplified once I go over what I would personally change about the movie. At least it's one version of what is possible and probably preferable. So I love the premise of what ended up being the opening scene in spite of itself. I think that while it and most of the movie are not written especially well, the execution of just about everything they set out to do is well done, even if not very effective. The dialogue there and some performances do drag a bit, most notably Danny, Beth, the little girls, the kid in the hallway, the guy with the drone at the lake. The movie is like a house built to evoke a certain feeling, but failing. Like, it has curb appeal, and the components are mostly very high quality, and they are mostly well placed as well, but the layout and room size ratios leave much to be desired. The movie opens with a drone shot that we assume is the Evil Dead flying about the place, about to possess someone before it is revealed to be a drone. I actually thought that this subversive element was pretty clever, but I don't know that it was positioned at the right point in the movie. Yeah, a lot of things in this movie are pretty clever, really. Everything is dying on me today. Yeah, so I did not even mind the initial altercation between Horse Girl and the guy with the heavy New York accent. We follow the Horse Girl inside as she checks up on her friend. I can even forgive the way she very obviously plays with her ponytail, foreshadowing what is to come, because we are getting into my favorite ruined scene in this movie. As she sits and reads, her possessed friend begins to mumble before sitting up and reciting some text from Wuthering Heights, which is very disturbing when taken out of context. The text. It's an amazing concept, really, this scene. It really did have the potential to be very disturbing, if only the voice effect of the possessed girl did not sound like a cheap audio effect and kind of inconsistent with the demonic voice of the possessed persons in the last film.
As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window.
Finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken.
Like something really terrible has happened, and we have to get out of here now, okay?
Don't understand. He's not gonna let you leave. I can smell your filthy soul.
Mia.
He's not here, you fucking idiot! Your little sister's being raped in hell!
I think that it would have been very disturbing if the scene lasted a bit longer too. I am sure that you, whoever you are, who are you? I'm sure that you have seen the movie, so I will not go into every little detail, or I'll try not to. Yes, It would have been more disturbing if we did not cut away from the two women immediately after the first attack to a guy pissing in the lake. Yes, that transition completely expunged the aura of tension that the foregoing scene worked to set up. Right, so Horse Girl gallops out to the deck for some reason. I suppose that the only reason she went out there was so that the three of them could be in the same place. Anyway, shortly after Horse Girl collapses, the possessed girl then grabs the drone, just hanging out in the air for some reason. No big deal. And then she lets it cut her face, and then the shot is cut short before she falls into the lake. That was foreshadowed, of course. I did appreciate that, but what I did not appreciate was how brief we saw her get cut before she flung herself into the lake dramatically. For no reason other than maybe to bait the guy into jumping into the lake, but then that just leads to one of the dumbest deaths in this, actually no, the dumbest death in this movie, because it happens completely off screen. I really hate that scene. Yeah, this happens a lot in the movie, the violence getting cut short. More about this when I talk about the film being soft. So yeah, the guy jumps in after her before dying in a very comical, bloody fashion, like he was somehow attacked by a shark. I almost want to believe that this is paying homage to some of those shark movies in which this tactic was employed, just bubbling up water and blood, but I don't know. The evil girl then rises out of the water, giving way to the title card, which is admittedly pretty cool, but I have to admit that I left that scene feeling quite a few things, and few of them were very positive. Where to even begin? So, first of all, this opening perfectly exemplifies this cycle of the development of tension and suspense before some comic relief, or it also comes in the form of inappropriate dialogue or silly effects. There was not a single scene in this movie apart from that one where the mother strolls into the kitchen to cook some eggs, innocent things. There was not a scene, except for that allows itself to be unsettling without utilizing, whether it realizes it or not, something dopey. Second of all, I would say that this opening helped to define this movie's boundaries a bit too early on, thus, at least for me, extinguishing a lot of the tension that could have been felt later on if they played their cards right. When I saw how they handled the opening scene, the prologue, so to speak, I was immediately able to recognize a rather dispiriting bit of information as a matter of fact. Simply put, the youngest girl featured prominently in the trailers would not die. I was correct in assuming that while they would put her in harm's way, she would not go through physical torment, just mental trauma, I guess. I did not want her to go through the same torture her siblings did. Really, I didn't want her in the film at all. I cannot tell you how many times children have been included in horror flicks, all the while the people or person behind the movie do not have the guts or, quite frankly, the wits to actually convince the audience that the child is in any actual danger. This movie had all of those tired tropes, even down to getting a scene where the child is about to get harmed or killed by our supposedly morally corrupt demon, only to see said demon hold back their final blow for just the right amount of time so the child can escape unscathed. Ugh. It's funny, really, that it is not a big deal depicting children going through really traumatic events, but it is one to have them die in gruesome or even quick ways, like the rest of the cast. Again, I should emphasize that I do not necessarily want children in horror films to die every time or even in gruesome ways. I'm just saying that if you are going to include them and want to make an effective horror movie, then you should avoid invoking a sort of invisible cloak of safety applicable to only them, and I guess also the adult delivers them from evil or to safety. It felt like the inclusion of a child in this movie was pointless, save for helping our protagonists prove themselves. In addition, it was also at times actually kind of detrimental to the film just because her lines were not all that good at all.
Are you hurt?
Are you gonna be a mom?
Yeah, one can see plainly that Cronin does not know how to write for children, or even adolescents, for that matter. Child actors are pretty notoriously not good, not because there's something wrong with the child, but because they were not directed well, or not a lot of directors have the talent to direct a child well, and then a lot of the time they're not given dialogue with which they may actually work. For example, multiple times throughout the movie, Cronin does this stereotypical thing wherein characters actually use their names or each other's names in sentences for what I assume is the establishment thereof.
Get out, Bridge!
Let's talk some more about suffering and agony, and I guess how Evil Dead Rise is soft when compared to its predecessor. Having that one child and arguably also those two adult actors playing teens did little for the movie, really mostly detracting from it for me. The problem with this is that one of the underlying themes of the movie, our protagonists' dilemma, their main obstacle, it relies on there being a child because, well, her problem is being afraid to be a mother or just not knowing what to do after having screwed up again.
What's going on with you, Beth?
I screwed up again like I always do.
Which is somewhat different from the material, more personal conflict that Mia in the last movie faced. By the end of Evil Dead, after having lost what was probably most of her friends, we do not really know where she goes from there or if she necessarily overcame her own addiction and achieved sobriety. That is the magic of it, really. We only know that she was able to detox. Oh wait, sort of. I think that I might have to take that back. I'm pretty sure that in most cases, former users need a bit more than a night to detoxify, though. Anyhow, somewhat the same can be said for Evil Dead Rise. So Beth's obstacle ends up being much more apparent in the demon's taunting and is sort of used as a means of building tension, some tension at least, that was kind of chastened, I'd say, before the main acts of the movie even began. I think I mentioned this already. Yes, I did mention that the opening scene deflated itself and almost set the movie up for failure because it revealed too much about the director and writers, which in this case is mostly the same person's, self-restraint, or rather their hesitance and thus their intentions. Even if you cannot really put it into words, you probably subconsciously noted that this movie, unlike the last, is going to opt to be more of a dark comedy and let up on some of the realism that made the last one terrifying in favor of that aforementioned surrealism and self-indulgent callbacks and some comic relief as well. You see, that's the thing. We were never allowed to feel for the characters, were we? Or at least not really. I mean, how could we, when it is so clear that the little girl is going to go unharmed, at least physically, when the mother's possession has what I at least felt was an underwhelming effect on her family, her actual death as well. When the deaths of their neighbors occurs mostly off-screen and in very cheesy, uninteresting, and cartoonish ways. When each character's pain is very limited. When the demon is no longer ruthless and depraved, but stereotypically, in a cartoon villain type of way, evil. In this movie, it just did not feel like the characters were truly suffering to me, and we, the audience, too, along with them, I guess. Don't get me wrong, I do feel that characters such as the mother were definitely brutalized more than she deserved. There was a lot of violence and gore throughout the movie as well, so I cannot claim that they were playing it safe in that regard. Throughout the movie, I found myself wondering where they are going to go next, knowing that we are going to end up seeing the aunt and little girl walk away in the end, unlike with Evil Dead, where I was unsure of who would walk away, if anyone at all. Well, the choices were limited in that movie, but still. I could see anything happening to Mia in the last, while here I just wonder what kind of filler they are going to use to get us to the obvious ending. This is the difference. The demon went from being about as evil as the demon in Where Evil Lurks to that of the Exorcist believers, for example, which is to say that the demon seems to have adopted some soft limits. The limit does exist, apparently. What I mean to say is that in Evil Dead, the attacks on our cast of characters felt very spontaneous. The choreography of those attacks was well rehearsed and it felt urgent throughout the movie's entire runtime. It really felt like the demon was eager to kill all of them and to be reborn. But then in Evil Dead Rise, the demon is a bit less proactive. It certainly takes its time, sometimes even delaying its attacks by toying with our characters. I can accept that in an isolated setting where the demon and its host are trapped, it is going to do what it can to mess with the victims it had. But here, it makes less sense to me. I mean, the demon had a way out of the building if it wanted to collect bodies so that it can form whatever that blob is at the end of the movie, then it had the rest of the building to explore, which apparently did have at least a few other inhabitants, so why not just use anyone? It's not just that either. Possessed persons have demonstrated immense upper body strength, so I'm not too sure that the staircase would have, or the collapse of the staircase would have prohibited the blob from accessing other floors, but it did also have the elevator and the vents and the fire escape. Let's talk about the progression of the possession. I will be the first to admit that I am not an Evil Dead aficionado, so I may be wrong in questioning this, but it seemed to me that the possession of Ellie, the mom, was a little bit too rushed. We barely meet her and get to see the relationship dynamic between her and her children before she is just gone, never to come back. She is barely awake or even cognizant after returning from the elevator where she was somehow possessed, probably in a different way to Mia before she completely loses control. I think that the hastened nature of her possession was not consistent with its predecessor, at least at the very beginning, and I think that hurts the movie. We do see, however, that afterwards the demon possessing her is still getting used to living in her body, but then again, it does exhibit remarkable strength pretty soon after reawakening. Honestly, I left just kind of confused. Of course, unlike with Mia, Ellie never sees the demon in the distance in advance of her possession, which definitely felt odd. From the instant the five friends and Evil Dead arrive at the cabin, the story revolves around and under them, technically. Evil is sitting idle under them, and clearly it is waiting for its release. So we know that it is not completely bound. Hey, Future Gil here for some intermission. So I initially spoke on how the demon was present before the passage was read in Evil Dead, but I made a mistake or two. So the first sighting of the demon did not actually occur until the passage was read, so there was no presence before that. I also noticed upon having gone through all of the behind the scenes clips and deleted scenes that the initial intention was to have David come back as a deadite before that scene got deleted. Indeed, the scene was added back in 2018. 5 years after the theatrical release of Evil Dead, so I assume that David coming back is canon. My point was initially about the discrepancy between the two movies, one demon being tenable while the other one unconquerable, or at least they said it was unconquerable. My point was that it was odd, but it turns out that in both movies neither were totally contained. I will, however, re-highlight the fact that the passage was forcibly read in Evil Dead, not read by choice. Needless to say, I was not too happy about that, being pro-choice. Anyway, I guess that in the absence of that, my explanation for why Evil Dead Rise fell flat for me toward the beginning in terms of how consonant the tone of the movie is was because it ceased to build up any tension in favor of a ton of foreshadowing and some character development, whereas in Evil Dead you had Mia going insane due to not being able to take her drugs, not to mention the fractured relations between that friend group that sort of contributed to the unease. The development of tension in this movie is not only stunted due to its filmmaking that in many regards is kind of evocative of the 90s and 2000s, most notably in its camera movements, camera angles, field of view to a fault, I'd say, but it's also stunted due to the absence of complications between our main characters, nor is there a real physical struggle like drug addiction that burgeons within our protagonist, or anyone for that matter, as the movie progresses, at least in the beginning. In fact, I can forgive myself for forgetting that this is even an Evil Dead movie for about a good 20 minutes after the opening scene. Especially towards the beginning, I felt like I was watching the director's narrative checklist rather than a group of people doomed to end up facing the demon that is to come while navigating their surroundings. One last thing to add really quickly, I decided to only revise the opening scene. I initially recorded myself going through alternative events for the rest of the movie, but I thought the video would be too long, which it already is. So yeah, keep that in mind, I guess. We basically get a glimpse of the evil in the opening scene, and then the action comes to a stop while we get to know the main cast as they interact with one another and let be known facts of their recent past, delivering that juicy exposition. And then the action just randomly starts up again as soon as the book is found randomly and the passage is read. You can probably tell that I am still pretty upset about how the book was discovered. It seems to me that there is no reason why the demon should cause a ruckus and the book should be discovered the very night on which Beth arrives in town, other than to have the movie happen and to roughly adopt Evil Dead's timeline. Huh? What was that? What would I have done differently if I could rewrite the script? Oh, that's not what you said. In order to fix the movie, to make it more effective and honestly scarier, then I would start by first moving that opening scene straight to the end of the movie. We can even move that title sequence to the end of the movie, since it seems to be very important to Cronin that we see text reading Evil Dead rising. There's no rule saying that your title sequence needs to show up at the very beginning. Gaspar Noé, for example, knows that much is true. Additionally, those three characters from the opening scene need their personalities toned down, or at least that guy with the Jewish American accent. This is random, but I don't know where to put this. I just want to say that I also do not like how the demon semi-defends that guy when it says,
Who's the brainless meatball now?
I don't know, I just don't think that Horse Girl did anything to deserve such rude treatment, and that guy was not worth defending. I guess you could call it an obsession, this fixation that Cronin has with ensuring that literally every last thing is foreshadowed or has some object or behavior hint toward it before it happens. Anyway, let the guy on the deck have his keys around his waist as he moves from the deck to scare Horse Girl with the drone. Let's get a shot of the lake house while hearing Horse Girl argue with the Jewish American, whom I will now refer to as the Bronx. Cut to a shot of him walking into the cabin to grab his keys, which he does, and after which he checks on his girlfriend to try to get her up, but she just stirs in bed, mumbling in her sleep, words we cannot yet make out. He looks at her, sighs, and then moves to the other side of the cabin where his drone is, but we do not see exactly what it is he picks up, so as to keep that mysterious. He can say something like, "I'll let you rest in peace then," as he makes his way out. We get that very same zipline perspective shot, whatever that's called, from the original opening scene. This can replace the one that we originally got at the end of the movie in the garage with that soon-to-be possessed blonde woman. So yeah, the Bronx scares Horse Girl with the drone and slowly approaches the deck with his keys, which he grabbed because he's supposed to be taking his girlfriend out to town to go to the hospital. Horse Girl was reading Wuthering Heights before she was so rudely interrupted. He is supposed to be in town by now at the behest of Horse Girl, at the nearest hospital with his girlfriend, because she was not looking too good. But according to him, she appeared to be sleeping, so he left her to rest. So then, annoyed by the sound of the drone and worried about her friend's well-being, Horse Girl leaves the lake to go check on her friend and see if she should take her to the hospital herself. Upon entering, she cannot find the keys, so she checks on her friend. She does appear to be sleeping. Maybe she is fine. So Horse Girl sits and begins to read her book. We get the same scene, more or less, wherein the possessed girl reads Wuthering Heights from memory before falling to the floor and convulsing. I will say that in this version, I want that scene to last longer though. Let's have her say a few other things after the close of the book. From that book, maybe text from that book, taken out of context. Horse Girl, of course, gets pummeled by her possessed friend in a struggle that I would want to last a lot longer than what it initially did. she should put up a bit more fight. I want Horse Girl to run to where the keys to the car were before the Bronx took them. And then we can even get a shot of her looking beyond the slowly approaching possessed woman on the opposite side of the room, maybe to the lake where the guy stands with his drone and presumably the keys as far as she knows, which he does have. Let's have the drone be sitting powerless on the deck as he fiddles with the controller, not flying randomly in the air just a few feet away from him, wasting the battery. So then Horse Girl tries to escape, but then gets her ponytail ripped off, all the same, in addition to the other brutalities done unto her, which is really dependent on what else is in that room. Of what can you make use, I guess. She runs out to the deck, beckoning for help, after which the Bronx turns and stands stunned. He looks beyond Horse Girl to his girlfriend, who appears more bruised and sickly after the indoor struggle, and he is speechless. Horse Girl reaches him, scalped, and then they proceed to back themselves into a corner on the deck as the possessed girl slowly approaches, closing the distance in between them. She then grabs the drone, powers it on with her demonic abilities that affect electrical equipment, and then starts cutting into her face, not letting up either. The Bronx freaks out and then tries to get her to stop before she kills him in a horrific way that does not really matter as long as it ends in them falling into the lake. All the same, Horse Girl cries out as she realizes that she is alone before the possessed girl rises out from the depths of the lake, having her moment. But let's actually make the rise a bit slower, marauding, more threatening, and then that can give way to the title sequence. As for the rest of the movie, God, I feel like there's too much that needs tinkering. I am of the opinion that the very pith of the movie is flawed, inherently so. Of course, I would definitely change the tone of the film. This was actually somewhat of an issue with the last one as well, but the dialogue of the movie is kind of cheesy. Okay, I've already started, so I guess I'll go ahead and give it a shot. I will, however, try not to go into too much detail with planning the rest of the movie. First of all, no kids, no pregnancy, no unnecessary issues to be overcome by the end of the movie. Arguably, the last one did not try this hard to give our main character a simple, single arc de fromage. I do not even think that you can make the movie take place in an LA apartment building without running into the issue of finding a way for the main character to actually find the book. You could say that the grown-up children of Ellie are all visiting her to help her move her things out, as she is one of the last people left in her apartment building. Definitely the only one on her level of the building. You can even have an earthquake, which makes the stairs collapse and the elevator break, because abnormal geological events are perfect means of isolation. But then how do they find the book? Why would the book even be in that building or find itself in that building of all places? Having an abandoned bank inexplicably be underneath them is a bit too convenient, if you ask me. I think that the premise for this movie, while executed rather well for what it could have been, is still flawed and kind of senseless. I do not think that the location is at all appropriate, really, not if you want someone to read from the Necronomicon. And I think that is pretty much it. If you got someone who clearly has some talent, at the very least, like Cronin, I'm sure that if given a solid initial premise, he could have written a better movie, especially if he were not tasked with writing for children. I do not, however, think that things such as the grade of the movie, the style of the set and props, the makeup, etc., I don't think that those have any faults at all. Of course, I am discussing why I feel the movie is imperfect, so I'm not really focusing or mentioning a lot of what I liked about this movie. I guess you can just take this as a reminder that I do not hate the movie or think that it is offensively bad. I just left it feeling underwhelmed without fully realizing why. But really, when all is said and done, I worry about this movie negatively affecting its successors. This franchise could actually turn out like, drumroll please, because we all knew that this was coming. Alien and Aliens. I knew that I would find a way to bring up Alien. What? Obsessed? Why do you keep suggesting that? Anyway, just think about it. Aliens reimagined Alien. It did not adhere to a lot of the rules of Alien. I mean rules as in what is to be expected in terms of behavior and in the metadata of the movie, like, for example, the genre and overall tone of the movie. Look, Evil Dead Rise did not do a lot of reimagining, but it did reintroduce some of the silliness from the original 20th century Evil Dead movies. If future Evil Dead sequels decide to follow this imperfect blueprint, then we could be looking at works from directors who might not understand what made Evil Dead 2013 such a special sequel, remake, reboot, soft reboot. We could be looking at Evil Dead sequels that endlessly call back to the originals, like Evil Dead Rise, without taking into consideration the progress made with Evil Dead 2013. They went from making low-budget, camp horror movies to big-budget blockbusters that do more than what is required of them as sequel, remake, reboot, soft reboots. Evil Dead Rise does not set the best of examples because Evil Dead Rise is imperfect. Hello again. Did you miss this version of me? Alright, I would like to, before this video officially ends, add one grievance of mine that I had not previously mentioned. I found this to be the case while editing, and then I would like to discuss a few other small details. I guess you could call them miniature grievances. So let's start with that one semi-large grievance. This is one with which none of the actors really seem to struggle with from the last movie, though the issue is not exclusively the fault of the actors in this movie, Evil Dead Rise, and that is pain tolerance and communicating struggles and pain through one's mannerisms, but consistently to the audience throughout the movie. I felt that there was a lot of inconsistency that, while not super perceptible, did tone down the horrific events of the movie quite a bit. I alluded to this, but I do not believe that I outwardly stated it. For example, did you remember that Beth had a knife go through her hand by the end of the movie? Did you feel secondhand a sense of literally any of Danny's pain? There was not only this, but there was also so little attention brought to the acts inflicted upon Ellie towards the end of her stay in the lift. Do you remember her arm getting broken in the last few seconds before the camera cuts away while she's hanging by wires or cables in the lift? I definitely would not have if I had not seen this movie multiple times at this point, mostly from scrubbing it for clips frame by frame. So not only do we see how she gets possessed, but we do not get to live in that moment very long. Cronin allots us plenty of time to act as voyeurs in this family's life, but he skims out on their trials. Anyway, one last thing. There is something that was meant to be a tradition when I first started it. I think I did that in the Aliens is Not Perfect video. Don't watch that video, by the way. And that is using my custom rating card. So yeah, I gave this movie a 5.5 out of 10, but I will round it up to a 6 on IMDb because it was just slightly more interesting, innovative, sure, and of a higher quality than your average decent 5 out of 10 or sequel. In case you were wondering, I have Evil Dead 2013 as an 8 out of 10, but if I do recall, I originally gave that a 7 out of 10, but honestly, the movie's rewatchability, attention to detail, which I guess you could also say Evil Dead Rise has in some ways, but then its masterful editing, plot structure, choreography, and the fact that just about every decision and plot point is justifiable makes it all the more perfect to me. Where was I? I really wanted to end my video on that last line. Evil Dead Rise does not set the best of examples. Evil Dead Rise is not perfect. There we go. Bye.